Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a phenomenal book I finished reading the other day called God to Us by Stephen Myers, Covenant Theology in Scripture. If you follow my channel, you may have seen my review at the beginning of last month, beginning of the year, on Heinrich Bullinger's work on covenant theology, which was the first book on covenant theology written in the Reformation. So it's showing sort of the beginnings of the development of these things in the Reformed tradition, although not in church history. It's something that goes back to the earliest days of the church. And this is a book that was published, I want to say just last year or the year before, 2021. So published just a few years ago, and I think shows a great kind of example of how that tradition has developed and enriched and nuanced down through the centuries. I told you in that other video that I'd be kind of having a couple of videos on books related to covenant theology, because that's something that our church is diving into more this spring in our adult Sunday school class. We're doing a study on covenant theology and infant baptism using a book that I have reviewed previously. I'll post a link to this, John T. Rhodes' book, Covenants Made Simple, Understanding God's Unfolding Promises to His People. It's actually kind of helpful to view these two books in conversation, because they are both great guides to a biblical and reformed understanding of covenant theology, but they do it from slightly different entry points. So John T. Rhodes is my favorite book to hand to someone who has never had the chance to really think about covenant theology, someone who maybe is just trying to figure out what is the argument, what scripture passages do I need to wrestle with, what are some of the implications of these things. And Rhodes gives a very simple, digestible, accessible, pastoral guide to the subject of covenant theology. You can see that even just in the size of the book. It's under 200 pages. There are no footnotes. It's not super academic. The chapters are fairly short. He's really good at just kind of illustrating and applying things. Phenomenal entry point to this subject. Myers' book is also an intro in the sense that it's a kind of overview of covenant theology as a whole, and so it's something that could be a starting point, but it's a very different animal. You can sort of see this is a thicker, bigger book, 350 some pages. There are extensive footnotes which will deal with a lot of scholarly issues. And, if Rhodes is sort of the best pastoral entry point for a layperson, I would say Myers is the best, more intermediate or even advanced kind of overview of covenant theology. It's not going to be as in-depth as some of you may have seen Crossway put out a couple of years ago, this, 700-page giant on covenant theology, biblical, theological, and historical perspectives. I haven't read all of this, but I've read from it. And it has essays, I think like 30 or more essays from a whole range of theologians, looking at, again, the biblical aspects of covenant theology, the historical aspects of it, some of the theological implications, and so forth. Massive work. This would be an advanced study kind of thing. But Myers occupies for me a real sweet spot that is sort of in between. It's something that may not be the first book you would hand someone on covenant theology, especially if they're not necessarily into theology as a whole, but it's a great next step for those who have gotten their feet wet, they've begun to understand some things, but maybe they still have questions or just want to dig deeper. And Myers does a phenomenal job of helping you go to that next level in your understanding of covenant theology and of its implications. So how is this book structured, and what are some of its features? Well, it's structured much like many books on covenant theology. One of the things about the study of covenant theology is that it's really a study of the story of the Bible. And so pretty much all books on covenant theology that I've seen will start you in Genesis and they'll work you through to Revelation, right? And it's looking at the different unfolding administrations of God's covenant dealings with his people, what was going on in the garden, what's going on with Noah, what's going on with Abraham, what's going on with Moses, with David, with the new covenant, and so on and so forth. So this book is very traditional in the sense that it follows that same path. It's going to walk you through the story of Scripture, the sweep of redemptive history, but while paying attention to the topic of covenant theology and seeing how that's developed through the pages of Scripture. So that's the basic framework that Myers is going to be working with. However, he has one feature that is really helpful as a kind of introductory or intermediate text, and that is he begins with a pretty extensive chapter, about 40 pages, on the history of covenant theology. Now, this is one of the features that would make me say this wouldn't be the first work I would hand to someone, because most people who are trying to just get their argument want to go straight to the Scriptures and understand it, rightly so. But if you have been reading about covenant theology or thinking about covenant theology, and maybe you've even heard, some of the different debates and discussions that have taken place, Meredith Kline versus John Murray, or, so on and so forth. You're trying to understand, what's a helpful way of kind of sifting through these different views or emphases within covenant theology. Myers' book as a whole is going to be very helpful, and that first chapter in particular, the history of covenant theology, is just, to me, worth the price of the book, because what he sort of does before he dives into the scriptural evidence, he just sort of puts in front of you, hey, here's how different people have thought about and talked about covenant theology. And he takes that by going back to the ancient church. How did the church fathers talk about covenant theology, looking at Irenaeus and others and their discussion of these things. He talks about how that was developed in the Middle Ages and emphasized in different ways. He talks about the Reformation and how it kind of comes into its own in that period, and why Lutherans have tended not to emphasize covenant theology, while Reformed churches have tended to greatly emphasize covenant theology. So he just kind of orients you to how this biblical theme, because it's something that's in the Bible. The word covenant appears 330 plus times in the Bible, Old and New Testaments together. So it's not, do you believe in covenant theology? It's, what do you believe about covenant theology? How do you understand these passages? How do you understand this biblical theme? And so he's helping you to see how different branches of the church in different places and in different times have talked about these things. And I found one of the most helpful is when he brings you into the 20th century to look at how covenant theology has been talked about more recently, because it's something that comes up a lot. And you get a number of figures who kind of have their own emphases and views, right? Some of which are unorthodox and heretical, many of which are just maybe a bit quirky or strange. And so, if you are a Christian here in the early 21st century and you're reading books that have come out in the last 50 years on covenant theology, you may find that kind of disorienting. People aren't kind of talking with one voice. And so he's going to just kind of lay that out for you so that you can understand the different camps and emphases and questions that have been raised. Now, he doesn't, in that first chapter, try to give you his answers to all of those questions. He just tries to get the questions in front of you, kind of bring you up to speed in the conversation. And then with that background, he does the kind of classic covenant theology survey thing. He goes to the covenant of works with Adam, and he works his way through the successive unfolding of those things. But one of the things that's very helpful is that now that you have that conversation in that context in the background, now that you know the questions that have been put on the table by different parties, Myers will then reference back to those things as he's walking through the biblical text and say, okay, so here's where this question comes from. And he'll try to help you answer that in a biblical way. So one of the things I really love about Myers is that he's not just giving you his own kind of particular take on things as if it's the only take. He's trying to orient you to the range of ways that people have talked about covenant theology. And then he's trying to enter into those discussions and give clear answers there. And I think one of the things that I like about Myers' book, as someone who holds to the Westminster Standards as a good kind of summary of covenant theology, is that he's very kind of traditionally covenantal and confessional. He doesn't have quirky views. He doesn't have kind of eccentric emphases. And he does a good job, I think, of very even-handedly saying, hey, here's what's helpful and here's maybe what's less helpful about some of the ways that covenant theology has been articulated and developed, especially in the last 50 to 100 years. So he's a great guide through covenant theology in that sense. And he's also relentlessly biblical. There is so much deep scriptural reflection here, where he's not just kind of throwing a bunch of proof text at you, but actually walking to particular passages and walking through them. One of my favorite chapters was at the end. He has a chapter, Covenant Theology in the New Testament, and he basically takes you to 3 big passages in the New Testament that are working within a covenantal framework. Romans chapter 5, 1 Corinthians 15, and then the end of the book of Revelation. And he just beautifully kind of draws out how these passages help us to see the kind of covenantal lenses through which the biblical authors understand the gospel and God's work. And so he's a great source. Even though he is a scholar, he has a historical sensibility, he's doing, in-depth theology at times, he's also very, very biblical. And another thing I really appreciate is, while he is definitely a scholar, and that comes out, it's a thicker book, there's lots of footnotes, there's an extensive bibliography in the back, he'll deal with Greek and Hebrew terms freely throughout. It is more academic in that sense. However, he's a good writer, so he's not hard to understand if you're willing to kind of do the work. And secondly, he has a pastor's heart. So he's a theologian with a pastor's heart. And so he will at times just kind of pause. It's like Paul, right, in the book of Romans. He'll be doing this deep, heavy theology, and he's dealing with all these different arguments and things. And then he'll just stop and say, oh, the riches of the wonder and the glory of God, from him and through him and to him are all things. He just breaks into this doxology, or he kind of step in and apply something in a way that's really powerful personally and pastorally. And Stephen Myers has that same emphasis. Something I should have mentioned at the front end, Stephen Myers is a professor at my alma mater, Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. He teaches in the PhD program, so I didn't have any classes with him, unfortunately, but he would frequently do chapel messages or give talks, and things. So I got to sit under him, and every single time I was impressed by this combination of scholarly rigor with pastoral sensitivity and humility. He's a very humble man, and I really appreciate. This was his first book that I've been able to read, and it's made me want to get everything he's written. And fortunately, he's early on in his career, so Lord willing, he will live a long time and bless the church with many more books. But it's that combination of scholarly rigor, historical sensitivity, scriptural saturation, confessional theology, and pastoral sensitivity that really makes this stand out. So while I have said, and I would still say, John T. Rhodes' book is my favorite entry point to covenant theology, if I had to list my favorite book on covenant theology, this would win the prize. It is just phenomenal. I really found nothing I disagreed with, which is rare in a book. Usually there's always little things, but there's really nothing I disagreed with in this book. I found it very, very helpful. If anything, if there's a critique, it's that I wish it was longer. I wish he had written more, especially as he got to the end. Again, he follows a very kind of normal pattern. You walk through the biblical evidence, and then you end with a few chapters drawing out, theological implications for our view of the church and the sacraments and things like that. He has a great chapter on that, chapter 13, Covenant Theology in the Church. I think he could have broken that into 2. I felt like at the end, as he was dealing with the church and the sacraments, everything he said was good, but I just wanted him to keep going and say more. So I would have loved for this to be a 14-chapter book and have covenant theology and the church dealing with the visible, invisible church distinction. And then I would have loved to see in a 14th chapter, covenant theology and the sacraments. Because while he does talk about that in chapter 13, it gets less attention than I would have liked to have seen. So I would have loved for him to just reflect a little bit more, give us a little bit more to chew on, but everything he gave was excellent. So again, if you are someone who is wanting to dig deeper into covenant theology, or who has found the subject maybe confusing and you just need a good guide, I would really strongly recommend you pick this up. It's published by Reformation Heritage Books. You can find it very affordably on their website and elsewhere. God to Us, Covenant Theology and Scripture by Stephen G. Myers.